His mother said she never slept right after that day. She said every night, when she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing. Her son, Mike, clinging to a wooden tree stump in the middle of a freezing lake, screaming for help, and no one coming. That image didn't come from her imagination. It came from a confession that took 17 years to get. Let me paint you a picture of Mike Williams, because this story only hits the way it should if you understand exactly who was lost. Mike was 31 years old, born and raised in Tallahassee, Florida. He went to Florida State University, graduated, and became a real estate appraiser. The kind of steady, responsible career that tells you everything about a man. He was handsome, physically fit, deeply religious, and genuinely kind in a way that apparently made everyone around him feel like they mattered. He was a devoted father to his baby daughter, Ansley, who had only just turned 1 year old. And he was married to his high school sweetheart, a woman named Denise Merrill, who he had known since they were teenagers. They married in 1994, 6 years together. Two people who looked from the outside like they had built exactly the life they were supposed to. He also had a best friend, Brian Winchester. They'd known each other since high school too, another Tallahassee kid, same tight circle. Brian had become an insurance agent. The two couples, Mike and Denise, Brian and his wife Kathy Thomas, socialized constantly. Double dates, hunting trips, family holidays. The kind of friendship that makes you think you know someone completely. Mike loved the outdoors more than almost anything. Hunting, fishing, disappearing into the marshes before the sun came up. It was ritual for him, not hobby. His friends said he hunted alone often, that he liked the solitude of it, the stillness. So on the morning of December 16th, 2000, a Saturday, nobody was surprised when Mike packed his gear before dawn, hitched up his boat trailer, and headed an hour north to Lake Seminole, a reservoir sitting right on the Georgia-Florida border. He told Denise he'd be home by noon. It was their 6th wedding anniversary. He had plans for a weekend getaway, a bed and breakfast, a quiet celebration with his wife. He kissed her goodbye and drove into the dark. He was never seen alive again. By early evening, the call started. Denise contacted friends, then family, then Brian Winchester, who later told investigators that he immediately got in his car and drove out to Lake Seminole with his father to help search. Think about that detail. Hold on to it. What they found at the boat launch told a story that didn't quite make sense. Mike's truck was there. His boat trailer was there. The boat itself was found nearby, floating empty, drifting, unoccupied. But here's what was in the boat. His shotgun, still zipped inside its case. His decoys, untouched, still packed away. A duck hunter at a lake before dawn who never unzipped his gun and never deployed a single decoy. He hadn't hunted. He hadn't even started to hunt. Investigators focused on one explanation. Mike must have lost his footing getting out of or into the boat, fallen into the freezing water, and drowned. The waders he'd have been wearing, those chest-high rubber hunting pants, would have filled with water and dragged him down fast. The lake was 8 to 12 feet deep near the launch. The water temperature was brutal. They told the Williams family that a drowning victim typically surfaces within 3 to 7 days. They promised the body would come up. It never did. After 44 days of searching, one of the most extensive searches ever conducted on Lake Seminole, they found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a bone fragment, not one drop of blood. And that's when they introduced the theory that would bury the truth for nearly 2 decades. Alligators. Wildlife experts and investigators put forward the idea that Mike's body had been consumed by alligators before it could surface. The lake had a large alligator population. Problem solved. Mystery explained. Except, and this is important, it was December. In northern Florida, the water temperature was barely above freezing. Alligators are cold-blooded. They don't eat in December. They barely move in December. They go into a torpor-like state, metabolically suppressed, hiding in the mud. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission itself would later confirm that alligator feeding in those conditions was, quote, scientifically improbable. But in 2001, nobody pushed back hard enough. Nobody except one person. Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, did not accept the alligator theory for a single day. She couldn't explain exactly what was wrong at first. It was instinct, the kind of knowing that lives in a mother's chest, not her head. Something about the story felt staged. Something about the silence from the people who should have been loudest, the people who claimed to love Mike most, felt wrong. Cheryl started making noise. She bought newspaper ads in the Tallahassee Democrat. She put up billboards. She stood on sidewalks with signs. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to state officials, to anyone who would listen. In 2009, she began writing to Governor Rick Scott every single day, asking him to appoint a special prosecutor to look at her son's case. Every day, for years, her own community began to distance itself from her. People thought she was in denial. That grief had broken her ability to accept reality. Even some people who had loved Mike privately wished she would stop. She didn't stop. Meanwhile, something was happening in Tallahassee that everyone could see, but no one was officially calling out. 19 days after Mike disappeared, before his body had even stopped being searched for, Denise filed claims on the life insurance policies. She petitioned a judge to have Mike declared legally dead in June 2001, just 6 months after his disappearance. She obtained the death certificate in July. She collected roughly $1.75 million in life insurance payouts. And then, and I want you to sit with the audacity of this, Denise Williams began openly dating Brian Winchester, the best friend, the insurance agent who had sold Mike the policies. By 2005, Brian had divorced Kathy, and he married Denise. Mike's mother watched all of this happen. She kept writing her letters. Here is what was actually happening behind closed doors, which would only come out 17 years later through a confession. In 1997, 3 years before Mike's death, Brian Winchester and Denise Williams began a secret affair. They had known each other since high school. According to Brian, they had even been briefly romantically involved as teenagers before Denise ended up with Mike. And in 1997, something rekindled. Brian described it in his confession as something that just snowballed. He and Denise were spending time together, and the friendship became something else entirely. By the time Mike and Denise's daughter Ansley was born in 1999, Brian and Denise were already deeply involved. They wanted to be together, properly, openly. But there was a problem. Denise wouldn't divorce Mike, not because she loved him. According to Brian, she refused because of two things. Her family was deeply religious and strongly opposed to divorce, and she was terrified that in divorce proceedings she would lose custody of Ansley, or at minimum have to share her. She would not risk it. And so, according to Brian's confession, Denise said something that should make your skin crawl. She said, "There's only one solution." They began planning a murder. And this is where it gets truly chilling, because they didn't just decide impulsively. They considered multiple plans. Denise apparently suggested staging a boating accident in the Gulf of Mexico that would kill both Mike and Kathy Thomas, eliminating both spouses at once. Brian refused. He didn't want to kill the mother of his children. They considered staging a robbery at Mike's office. Too risky. Then Brian had an idea. He and Mike had gone hunting together in Arkansas the previous year, and Mike had gotten stuck in quicksand. Brian had pulled him out. He knew the outdoors was Mike's world, and that a hunting accident, a drowning, would be the most believable story possible. 6 months before the murder, in the middle of 2000, someone helped Mike take out a new, massive life insurance policy. That someone was Brian Winchester. The man who would kill him signed his death warrant and got paid a commission on it. This is the part the original story got wrong. Mike Williams did not go to Lake Seminole alone. Brian Winchester was with him. According to Brian's confession, recorded by investigators and played for the jury at Denise's trial, Brian met Mike at the lake that morning under the guise of a normal duck hunting trip. They'd done it dozens of times. Nothing unusual. Mike had no reason to suspect anything. Out on the water, Brian told Mike he wanted to show him a secret special spot he'd found. He steered the boat toward it, and then he pushed Mike overboard. Brian's plan was simple. Mike would be wearing heavy waders. The waders would fill with water. He would sink. He would drown. And Brian would report that Mike had an accident, that he'd simply fallen out of the boat. But Mike Williams was an experienced outdoorsman. Strong, not easily panicked. He didn't sink. He struggled in the freezing water, managed to get the waders partially off, and swam. He reached a tree stump rising from the lake bed and grabbed onto it. He held on. Brian circled the boat. He later described what happened next in court, and witnesses said he was in tears on the stand. Whether those were real tears or performance, I'll leave to you. He was in the water, struggling, but he was taking the waders and the jacket off, and he swam over to one of those stumps and held onto it. He was panicking, and I was panicking, and I didn't know how to get out of the situation. So Brian loaded his shotgun. He circled the boat once, twice, and as he passed Mike, his best friend, clinging to a stump in a freezing lake, screaming for help, he fired. He shot Mike Williams in the face. Then he loaded the body into his truck, drove home, went back to bed next to his wife Kathy, and waited. A few hours later, Denise Williams called Brian's wife Kathy, frantic, saying Mike hadn't come home. And Brian Winchester got back in his car and drove to Lake Seminole. He joined the search party. He helped look for the man he had just murdered. He stood next to Mike's family. He hugged people. He cried. Mike's remains were driven to a dry creek bed near Carr Lake, about an hour from Tallahassee. Brian buried him there, and then he returned to the lake, where searchers were looking for a ghost, and made sure the staging was complete. Over the following months, he returned to plant Mike's gear in the water. The waders, the jacket, the hunting license tucked inside, the flashlight that impossibly still worked after 6 months underwater. Cheryl Williams had been right about the staging all along. She just couldn't prove it. For years, Brian and Denise played the perfect couple. They had Mike's daughter. They had his insurance money. They went to church. They lived their life in Tallahassee. But something was rotting underneath. Brian Winchester, according to reporting, developed a serious drug problem and a sex addiction. His behavior became increasingly erratic and destructive. By November 2012, he and Denise separated. In 2015, she filed for divorce, and Brian couldn't handle it. On August 5th, 2016, as Denise was leaving Florida State University, Brian slipped into the back seat of her car and hid. When she got in, he pointed a semi-automatic pistol at her ribs. He had completely lost it, Denise told police afterward. He kept saying, "I've lost everything. I have nothing to live for." He held her at gunpoint, driving around, begging her not to go through with the divorce, threatening to kill himself, terrifying her. She eventually escaped. She called the police. Brian Winchester was arrested for armed kidnapping and aggravated assault. And that's when the detectives who had never fully let go of Mike Williams' case got their opening. When you're facing serious prison time and investigators are asking about a 17-year-old unsolved disappearance, your options narrow fast. Brian Winchester folded. In 2017, he made a deal, full immunity from prosecution for Mike's murder, in exchange for a complete confession and testimony against Denise. He told them everything: the affair, the planning, the multiple rejected plots, the lake, the stump, the shotgun, the body. And then he led investigators to Carr Lake, the dry creek bed an hour from Tallahassee, where Mike Williams had been buried for 17 years. Mike's remains were recovered. In December 2017, Brian Winchester was sentenced to 20 years for the kidnapping. He walked away from a murder charge entirely. Not one day in prison for what he did to Mike Williams on that lake. Nobody's officially charged with his murder. Mike's friend Scott Dungy told ABC News. That was the only way. They would never have got the body, and Denise would still be out running free. Make of that what you will. Denise's trial ran December 10th through December 14th, 2018. Brian Winchester sat on the witness stand and testified against the woman he had spent years describing as his great love, his partner in everything. He called her Bonnie and Clyde. He said, "We were partners in crime." The defense went hard at him, and they had ammunition. Her attorney, Ethan Way, laid it out plainly in cross-examination. "You pulled the trigger." "Yes, sir." "Denise had no idea that you shot her husband in the face with a shotgun, did she?" Brian's answer was complicated. He claimed Denise had been the architect of the whole plan, that she had said there was only one solution. But he admitted she wasn't there. She hadn't pulled the trigger. She'd been home, building her alibi. The defense argued that Brian Winchester was a manipulative, obsessive man who had used Denise and had now found a way to escape a murder charge by pinning the conspiracy on her. They pointed out he'd kidnapped her at gunpoint. They questioned whether anything he said could be trusted. The jury convicted her on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. In 2020, a Florida appeals court overturned the first-degree murder conviction. They ruled the state hadn't sufficiently proven her direct involvement in the killing itself. Her conspiracy conviction and her 30-year sentence stood. As of now, Denise Williams is in prison. Brian Winchester is serving his kidnapping sentence. Neither has been convicted of Mike's actual murder. The man who shot Mike Williams in the face has never been convicted of murder. Mike's daughter, Ansley, who never knew her father, stood up in court and said she does not believe her mother was involved. She said, "There's no way my mother would conspire to kill my father. He acted independently of her. I never once saw him consult with her about anything." Ansley was raised by the people who, the state says, murdered her father. After the verdict, reporters asked Cheryl Williams how she felt. She didn't talk about victory. She didn't talk about justice. She said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. "When I go to bed at night and I try to go to sleep, I see Michael clinging to that stump in the lake. And I hear him calling, 'Help, help.'" This woman spent 17 years being called crazy, being dismissed, being told she was a grieving mother who couldn't accept reality. She watched Denise collect her son's life insurance. She watched Brian Winchester marry his widow. She wrote letters every single day to a governor who mostly didn't respond. She stood on sidewalks with signs. She took out billboards. And she was right about every single thing. The alligators, the staging, the evidence planting, the people who stood at the search party and looked for a man they already knew was dead. She was right. Here is the thing nobody wants to say directly. This case was never solved by good police work. It was solved because a murderer fell apart 16 years later and kidnapped his wife at gunpoint. If Brian Winchester had been a more stable criminal, if he had simply let Denise go through with a divorce and moved on with his life, Mike Williams would still be an alligator statistic, an accidental drowning, a cold case footnote. The whole truth almost didn't come out. And the man who actually pulled the trigger is serving 20 years for kidnapping, not for murder. Mike Williams was shot in the face by his best friend in a freezing lake on his wedding anniversary while clinging to a tree stump trying to survive. His murderer made a deal and walked. His mother spent 17 years of her life fighting for a justice that, by any honest measure, was only partially delivered. And Mike's daughter is growing up carrying the weight of all of it. Her father gone, her mother in prison, her entire childhood built on top of a lie. That's the real story of Lake Seminole, not the alligators, not the lake, the people. If this case is new to you, I'd recommend the 4-part ABC News Studios documentary, Mr. and Mrs. Murder. It's streaming on Hulu and has interviews with people close to the case that add a lot to what I've covered here. Cheryl Williams is interviewed in it. Watch it. You'll understand why this woman is genuinely one of the most remarkable people in this entire story. If you've been watching for a while, you know the drill. Leave a comment with what you think the most inexcusable failure in this investigation was. Was it the alligator theory? The life insurance timeline? The fact that they let the star witness walk on murder? I'll be in the comments. See you in the next one.